Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my How Did They Stack Up series. Today we will be talking about RB, and how they stacked up against Williams behind them, and Haas ahead of them in the constructor standings. We'll also talk about each driver and where they compared in the driver's standings to the people and the drivers around them. So we'll see some graphs and some little bit of points in there where they scored points from what each race was, and how they really stacked up comparatively to the ones that are ahead of them and ones that are behind them. To start us off, we will look at some general stats for RB and its three drivers, Yuki Tsunoda, Daniel Ricciardo, and Liam Lawson. So as you can see here, RB ended up the constructor standings in 8th position. They had an average starting position of 12th and an average finishing position of 12th, and they had 7 DNFs. Now, of course, the DNFs were not necessarily crashes, but also included stuff like breaking of equipment or other things that caused the car not to finish the race. And so we will get a little breakdown between the drivers for those things, but we also see that the positionings that they started on were just outside the point range, and they couldn't really make up that ground throughout the race. So they ended up the race in that same position that they started off with. So that didn't give them the edge that they needed. I mean, they could occasionally break through and get those points in the constructor standings, but they couldn't do it on a consistent basis as they were falling just outside that range in their finishing positions. Now, if we break that down and look at Yuki Tsunoda, his standing was 12th in the driver's standing. His average starting position was 11th, and his average finishing position was 12th. And he had 4 of those DNFs over the season. So he had a full season, so he had a little bit extra time to deal with those extra races. And so you have to take that into account when you're looking at the DNF marker comparatively to his teammates. But as you can see here, started just outside the point range, but lost a position throughout the average race period. So he ended up in 12th instead of trying to gain that position into that 10th point where he would actually get those last bit of points that the team was looking for in this season. They weren't quite able to get into that point range as they needed to on a consistent basis. We go to Daniel Ricciardo, whose driver's championship was in 17th position, so quite a bit farther back than Yuki Tsunoda was. His average starting position was 13th, and his average finishing position was 13th, and he had 2 of those DNFs. Now, as you can see here, he fell behind Yuki Tsunoda in his standings of his average starting position and his average finishing position. So he wasn't able to gain ground in the race, and he was not able to really keep it close to his teammate overall in the averages on the starting position either. That's one of the reasons why Daniel Ricciardo was let go midway through the season, as he really wasn't performing up to the task that the team needed him to do. Now, we all love Daniel Ricciardo. He has a great personality, and we hate to see him leave F1, but as a team standing, he just wasn't performing as well as Yuki and as they needed to him to get into that point range to help the team out. Liam Lawson, who's coming in midway through the season, his driver standing was 21st, so he is farther back behind Daniel, but didn't get as many races, I don't think, in this season. And he started off in 13th position and ended up in 13th position and had 1 DNF. So he was kind of on par, in my view, over the races that he was in with Daniel Ricciardo and where he started and where he finished. So is he a good replacement for Daniel? That's kind of hard to say. In this realm, you would think potentially, because he's a newer driver, that he may be able to learn some other extra stuff, whereas Daniel was a experienced driver, so you're expecting more from him overall. We will have to wait till see for next season when he actually gets bumped up to the senior team, the Red Bull team, and see if he can come anywhere close to Max Verstappen and be a good replacement for Sergio Perez. But in this standing of this season, I think he was a decent driver. I liked Liam Lawson a lot. So here we see the RB drivers compared to each other in the sprint races. So we have Yuki in blue, Daniel in red, and Liam in yellow. And on the x-axis, we have the 6 sprint races that were held this year. And we have the y-axis on the finishing positions in those sprint races. So as you can see in these trend lines, that Daniel started off very strong and then got poorer throughout those 3 races that he was able to compete in for those sprint races, those first 3. And he basically had a decent start just outside of the point range, got into the points in Miami, and then fell quite far back in Austria. Whereas Yuki kind of followed his pattern, but just behind him on those first 2 races, but was able to get ahead of him in the Austria sprint race, and then continued to get better in the Circuit of the Americas race, and then fell back a little again in the Brazil and the Qatar races. And then we have Liam Lawson in the last 3 races, who did poorly on his first one in Circuit of the Americas, but did really well in his Brazil race, and then fell back to where he started off with in that Qatar race. And so if you look at those trend lines, of course, the going down is the better trend line because that's the better finishing position for those drivers. So you want to see a downward movement in these trend lines, where we don't see that for either Yuki or Daniel, as they were getting worse throughout the season on the sprint race finishes. Now for Liam Lawson, he kind of has that steady stream. He may be getting slightly better, but it's pretty much a flat line for him across those 3 races for his trend line. So in this regard, you can kind of see that Daniel started off strong and got worse, and Yuki was kind of following him, but in a slower pace. So he started off a little bit worse than Daniel did, but got worse slower than Daniel did throughout this full season. So he was able to start recovering a little bit of what his end result was be. And then Liam Lawson was kind of a flat, steady line across the board, kind of starting off behind all of them, but ended up ahead of them at the end of the season if you kind of look at the trend line measurements. So we will move on from comparing the 3 RB drivers to comparing Yuki Tsunoda, who actually finished the whole season. So we will look at Yuki and where he ended up comparative to the drivers around him in the Drivers' Championship. So we will look at Lance Stroll and Nico Hülkenberg. So here we can see Yuki in blue, Lance in green, and Nico in red. So as you see here, Nico is actually getting better, whereas Lance Stroll and Yuki are getting worse throughout the sprint season. We can have that DNF for Lance Stroll in Miami, so he didn't get a point there, but you can kind of look at that where he was kind of started off poorly, got a little bit better, close to the points, and then fell away at the end of the season, where we can compare that with Yuki, who was doing the same thing, but was actually getting better at Miami, when Lance kind of failed in that DNF, kind of got worse in Austria compared to Lance Stroll, and then was getting better again at Circuit of the Americas and the rest of the season until Qatar, where they flipped again. And so you can kind of see that comparison mark between those 2 drivers, but Yuki seems to have the edge over Lance Stroll over the whole season, even though that was tailing off at the end of the season, I would say. At the very end, I think Lance Stroll had the advantage over Yuki compared to those trend lines, but I don't think that really plays into account the full front of the season in this regard if you're looking at him. Now, if he kept going in that same trend continued, then that would be the case where Lance Stroll would beat out Yuki. But we look at the comparison between Yuki and Nico. They both started off poorly. They both started off getting better in Miami, and then went backwards in Austria, and then went forward in Circuit of the Americas. And then Nico had a DNF in Brazil, so we don't get a marker there, so we can't really compare those that race. But in Qatar, Nico did a much better than both Stroll and Yuki, so he did a lot better. So his full trend line is getting better throughout the season, and pretty heavy incline in that trend line as well. So he was far used to that Haas and was able to get most out of that Haas throughout the season and getting better throughout the season, whereas Yuki in that RB and Lance Stroll and his Aston Martin were kind of getting worse throughout the season in the results of the sprint race. And so we kind of compare those, where Yuki was probably closer to Lance Stroll than he was in Nico in the sprint race is this season. So we move on to look at Daniel Ricciardo, who started off the season with the RB but was replaced midway through the season. And so we only get the first 3 races that he completed on the sprint races, and we'll compare him against Oliver Behrman, who finished behind him, and Alexander Albon, who finished ahead of him in the drivers' standings. And as you can kind of see here, it's kind of interesting because Daniel was doing much better than Alexander Albon during these sprint races altogether, but was getting a worse area. His trend line was going backwards, so he was getting worse throughout the season, and you can see that crossover at Brazil. Now, as I said, Daniel only was able to complete the first 3 sprint races, and so those are the main ones we have to look at. Now his trend line is getting worse, where Alexander Albon is getting better throughout the season. So he is actually trending down, which is better. So he's getting better finishing positions in those sprint races, but was falling behind Daniel at those first 3 races significantly. His car in that Williams was getting slightly better throughout the season and is able to get a little bit more out of that Williams comparative to Daniel in that RB in those first 3 races. Now we have the one sprint race that Oliver was actually able to compete in Brazil, who finished behind Albon, and we could only kind of guess at where he would have compared to Daniel in this lineup. But overall, you can see Daniel is doing better than the people that were ranked ahead of him in the driver's standings. So we'll have to figure out and kind of play favorites or kind of look into a predictive future to see if that would have held if he was there for the rest of the season, or if that trend line is the true trend line for Daniel in this season and would have gotten worse, ended up behind Albon and Oliver Behrman if they had performed the full season alongside of Daniel. Finally, we get to see how Liam Lawson kind of compared to Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou in these sprint races. Now, Valtteri was behind him in the driver's standings, and Guan Yu Zhou was ahead of him in the driver's standings, so we can kind of compare those drivers in these sprint races. Liam only performed the last 3 sprint races, so we have to guess on those front 3 based on the trend line that we have and try to compare those drivers in this ranking. If we look at those, like the first 3 or 4 races, we have Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou starting off fairly strong, but that middle section got kind of weak, and they were kind of tailing off with Guan Yu Zhou getting worse throughout the season, and Valtteri Bottas getting back to where he was at the beginning of the season in these sprint races. So if you compare those last 3 races that actually Liam Lawson was able to compete in for those sprint races, we can see that he did better in the first 2 comparative to those 2 drivers. And in that last race in Qatar, he was ahead of his competitor, Guan Yu Zhou, who finished ahead of him in the constructor standings, but finished behind Valtteri Bottas, who he finished ahead of in the driver standing. So we see that line, and we can kind of compare these trend lines where Liam Lawson is pretty steady. So he had a good feel in that, not getting really worse, but not really getting any better in the sprint races. And so we tend to want him to be getting better overall throughout the season, but we definitely don't want to see that worse, that upward trend on that trend line. Now, if you compare that trend line to Valtteri Bottas's, who was getting slightly worse throughout the season, he started off decently, and overall he was coming back at the end, but not enough to really change that trend line in this ranking. And then, of course, you have Guan Yu Zhou, who's finished ahead of Liam Lawson in the driver's standing, but had a very poor trend line in the sprint races, where he started off strong and then ended up fairly weak in the sprint races. As Guan Yu Zhou finished ahead of his teammate for the first 3 or 4 races, and then kind of tailed off at the end. So we'd have to see how that would play out if it was a full season of sprint races. We only get to have 6, so it's a kind of a smaller data set that we get to look at. Now we get to the meat of the situation, where we look at the GP races for the RB drivers. So we have Yuki again in blue, Daniel in red, and Liam Lawson in yellow. And as we can see here, Daniel has a pretty flat line behind Yuki Tsunoda, who is kind of in that close to the 10th marker range, that 10th place marker, but just behind that. So not quite where he needed to be to get a good steady point all throughout the season, ahead of his teammate Daniel Ricciardo. Now you look at the last few races that Liam Lawson joined this season. And we kind of see a mixed bag for Liam Lawson, where he did good in a couple of races and fairly poorly in 3. Now his trend line is, looking at that, is fairly horrible, going upwards, but you have to kind of figure out where he lines up in relationship to Yuki Tsunoda in those settings. So we think that he has a better setup in Circuit of the Americas, as he did much better. He did kind of poorly in Mexico, where Yuki kind of DNF'd in that situation, so he has a kind of an advantage there. Then we come back to Brazil, where Liam Lawson did worse than Yuki, and again in Las Vegas and Qatar, where Liam Lawson had another DNF in Abu Dhabi, so he didn't actually get to complete his trend, kind of going downwards. But they think that there's enough, apparently, advantage in Liam Lawson coming in that they've moved him to the senior team, their Red Bull team, to compete alongside Max Verstappen. So we'll have to kind of compare and see if he's really up to that challenge to replace Perez, or if he's going to fall behind and be like an Alex Albon or a Pierre Gasly and kind of drop mid-season. So we'll have to wait and see for the full season and see how he plays out. I really like Liam Lawson in his driving. Kind of hope for the best, but it's hard to say where he's going to end up, as I really don't see him being that competitive against Max, and to see if that trend is going to be there or not. If we look at Yuki here, he's doing fairly good at the beginning of the season, and that mid-season, kind of around Canada, he was kind of dropped back, kind of had this yo-yo effect throughout the season. Kind of followed Daniel Ricciardo in that yo-yo effect. A little bit of mixture in that Great Britain race, but was kind of coming back at the end, getting a little bit better, where we see Daniel Ricciardo kind of tailing off. So in overall, I think that RB was doing kind of mixture there. Good races for certain tracks, but kind of poor at other tracks. And I think that's why you see that yo-yo effect kind of follow these drivers along in that same pattern. So you kind of have to play that out in your mind. Who could get the most out of that RB? It kind of looks like it was kind of a mixture between the two, leaning towards Yuki Tsunoda for the first part of the season, and then it kind of tailing off near the end. So I'm not sure where that plays out for Yuki, as I think he's still a good driver, and I think he could do really well if he was given a good car that really fit his style, was able to really compete. I think you can kind of see here that he's able to get decent results in comparative to his teammates. I think he was doing really well and probably outshined his teammate in this season, even though he had a kind of a mixture of teammates from the first part and the second part of this season. And as we continue to talk about Yuki Tsunoda, we'll switch over and compare him against Lance Stroll and Nico Hülkenberg for the GP races. And again, we see Yuki in blue, Lance in that Aston Martin green, and Nico Hülkenberg in red. And if you look at this whole graph here, you can kind of look at those trend lines, and you can still see Nico Hülkenberg getting better throughout the season and is ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, but Yuki Tsunoda has a nice steady line across the board. So he's a good stable contender in that RB, where Lance Stroll was getting worse throughout the season. And I think that's really more to the driver than it is towards that Aston Martin not gaining the ground it needed in the second half of the season, not gaining those developments to push that card forward. I think Lance Stroll kind of lost interest as he wasn't being that competitive in those range, so he just kind of lost interest and didn't try as hard as he could. And I think that's mainly due to how his position in that Aston Martin is being held. With his dad being the owner, he doesn't have that really threat of losing that driver's position to keep him motivated when things don't quite go his way. So I think that's why, even though his trend line is going down, he is still going to be in that car next season. Compared to those people around him with Yuki and Nico Hülkenberg, he is kind of losing out in that realm as well. We're kind of focusing on Yuki, so he's doing much better than Lance Stroll this season, I think. He did start off behind Lance Stroll, but quickly kind of changed that around that Canada marker and was able to continue that decent run in these GP races where Lance Stroll kind of fell behind. Now, if you look at Yuki compared to Nico Hülkenberg, again, he started off about the same position as Nico Hülkenberg, but Nico Hülkenberg was able to gain ground fairly quickly on Yuki Tsunoda in those first races and slowly gain that gap between him and Yuki in that drivers championship. And you can kind of see that in these races. Yuki was losing some of those in that midsection, that Canada and that Great Britain races, even though they kind of followed a slightly same pattern, gaining or losing positions in those GP races. Nico was able to edge him out overall, gaining the most out of that Haas, whereas Yuki was not able to really gain that ground on that Haas in these situations. Here we can look at Daniel Ricciardo compared to Oliver Behrman and Alexander Albon. We have Daniel in blue, Oliver in red, and Alexander Albon in that aqua or teal color. And if you look at those trend lines, you can see Oliver Behrman kind of getting worse throughout the season, but you have to take into effect he moved from that Ferrari at that very beginning of the season to the Haas on those last 2 races that he competed in. So he had a little mixed bag of constructors there he was competing with. Now, I think he did really good in that Haas compared to where everything was. Ferrari, he did really well. The Haas, I think he did really well in the actual machinery that he was given in that Haas. I think he was able to compete fairly well in that Haas, and that's why he was kind of moving forward in that Haas for next season. Where we see Daniel's comparison against Alexander Albon is very close. It's almost kind of a who knows if Daniel would have finished the season up if it had been the ending as it was. But right now, Alexander Albon edged out Daniel Ricciardo in that trend line, has got better at the very end. I think mainly that was due to that Williams constructor being able to gain grounds finally at the end of the season, getting those updates that it needed to really help out its drivers in this aspect. And so you really have to look at that midsection where you had that gap at the very beginning between the 2 drivers, and you have a gap at the end when Daniel was no longer competing. So if you look at that midsection, you have 3 score chances for Daniel, and you have the 3 that basically was right around that edge for Alexander Albon as well. But you kind of look at those aspects of it. Daniel had very much a start of the season kind of getting worse, whereas Alexander started off worse and started getting better throughout the season. So I think you can kind of look at those very closely tied together, kind of in those finishing positions, kind of following somewhat of the same trend, but in other aspects, they're completely different depending on what race you're looking at compared to those constructors, how well they did on those races. But you kind of look at those trends, I think you can kind of see that difference between the trend lines in that section of the circuit of the season, so that we can kind of see that Alexander is getting better at that point overall that season, where Daniel was getting worse at that point. And so I think at the end, if Daniel could have competed the last part of that season and followed that same kind of marker, you kind of look at that and see where he would have ended up overall. But very competitive against Alexander Albon and Daniel Ricciardo, so we'll have to see how that plays out as well next season with Alexander Albon competing against Sainz, so a very experienced driver in that same Williams machinery. So we'll have to see how that compares and see if that edge comes out to be Sainz, or can Alex keep up with him and maybe even outdo Sainz in that same machinery. And finally, we get to compare Liam Lawson against Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou in that drivers' championship ranking for that last part of that season. So he only competed at the very end of the season. So those are the ones that you have to kind of look at overall. But right now we see Liam Lawson in blue, Valtteri Bottas in that nice rich green, and a Guan Yu Zhou in that lighter green. Trying to keep those constructors' colors matching in this ranking here, but you can see that up and down at the end for Liam Lawson, where he had started off good, had a bad race, did good, and then had a bad race, got better, but not as good as he needed to, and then had a DNF at the end. So his trend line is going up, which is horrible in this situation. A pretty steep incline out of the point error. So if you compare Liam Lawson against the kick drivers for Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou, he was doing better overall than those 2 drivers, even though it kind of looks bad in that situation, because he was able to get into those points twice, whereas Guan Yu Zhou was only able to get at the very end in Qatar that extra point to kind of get him close to that marking. In that back of the pack, it seems like Liam Lawson was kind of like into the points or far back, whereas Valtteri Bottas was more steady in his end rankings. Guan Yu Zhou was kind of more of an up and down as well, kind of falling behind, and except for a couple of races where he's able to really gain some ground and get ahead of Liam Lawson in that running. So you can kind of glance at that and kind of figure out where things lie between that RB and that Kick Sauber F1 team at the end of the season, where finally Kick was able to start gaining a little bit of ground at the very end of the season. RB team was able to actually get going fairly early and then kind of tailed off and was starting to get back, I think, at the end of the season as well, kind of get those tweaks done with Liam Lawson coming in and trying to do what he could to get a better result and really show what he can do. So that gives us through all of the drivers and their GP rankings and how they compared. So now that we are done comparing the drivers and where they stood against the other driver competitors, we will look at the team as a whole. And so we are looking at RB versus Williams versus Haas. And of course, on the x-axis, we have all of the races for the GP races and the position points that they scored on the y-axis. And so this kind of gives you a feel of how they did throughout the season and where they gained points and how they were doing. Now the trend line now is if it's going up is better, because that means there are more points that are gained throughout the season. So as we see here, RB is going down throughout the season. It's good at the very beginning, and they were kind of tailing off. They had that good Brazil race, but overall they were doing worse at the end of the season than they were at the beginning of the season comparatively. So their trend line is going down, which is bad, whereas we see Haas on a nice steady incline, doing fairly well throughout the season, starting off not quite as well, but ending up strong. And you have Williams, who is a slightly inclined. So they would start off poorly and kind of gain ground slowly throughout the season. But you can kind of compare where they gained their points and kind of figure out where they were comparatively to those teams around them and those points. So you can kind of look and see if they were competitively other teams around them at those races and where they gained ground and how that looks overall the season to see how that plays out. Now we move over to the step graph, which is the same information, but just in a step graph format. And you can kind of see where they ended up in that overall point marker, with Haas gaining ground over RB near the end of the season, whereas Williams kind of struggled along throughout this beginning of the season, was able to gain some points, but not quite where they could be competitive against the RB team. Here you can basically see that Williams was lacking between RB and Haas, whereas RB, they started off strong, got ahead of Haas, got ahead of Williams, and kind of plateaued in that mid part of the season and gained a few points at the end of the season, but not quite enough to really overtake Haas in that constructor's standing. So what's coming up next, we have Haas and how Haas stacked up against the teams around them. So if you'd like to see this, I would appreciate a subscription so that you don't miss out on that video. And if you made it this far, I would appreciate a like as well. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.